Hi, I'm Elliot Kaufman. I used to produce movies in legacy Hollywood, and now I exploit their disasters. By learning from the missteps of mishandled franchises, we forge the base new wave. Stranger Things' fifth and final flop of a season has started a firestorm of breakdown videos and viral rants. What went wrong? When did it go wrong? And why? We've broken down all your grievances by highlighting a few underrated channels that deserve some love. Your love. Together, we'll commiserate about what was, imagine what could have been, and what you can do to learn from their $500 million mistake so your writing feels fresh and timeless. We're going to take one grievance per video, crowdsource the most legit criticisms, distill everything down, and maybe even add our own take, all to avoid the same storytelling mistakes they made. But just a word of warning, if you make it to the end of this video, you'll have to mourn the show that could have been in this episode of Could Have Been Canon. After a few uneven episodes, Stranger Things Season 4 ended with a bang, a cliffhanger to end all cliffhangers. Vecna, aka Henry, aka the Big Bad, killed 4 victims, opening 4 psychic gates between the real world and the Upside Down, forming a cross-shaped pattern of massive sinkholes across the town of Hawkins, merging the 2 worlds. The rupture seemed catastrophic. Ash-like particles fell from the sky. The landscape resembled the Upside Down. The 2 worlds had finally merged. 11, played by Millie Bobby Brown, made one of the 4 facial expressions she is capable of emoting. This seemed serious. This pothole or sinkhole cliffhanger seemed like it would change everything. The Duffer Brothers were brandishing that season 5 would be action packed and super serial. It seemed like Stranger Things as a series and the town of Hawkins was about to be turned on its head, or upside down, if you will. The potholes were the perfect opportunity for the show to change genres and move the story and the characters forward. But then, Stranger Things kind of forgot about the potholes. We're going to be looking at 4 clips from 4 different YouTube channels, all talking about not only Stranger Things Season 5, but specifically this pothole problem. And because they're different channels, they're all going to talk about it in a slightly different way. This first channel is called Hold My DualShock, and they are a duo that is a male and female. I don't know if they're romantically involved or they're just friends. That's really not my business. But they have a really good rapport with each other. They're very good at talking about trends and kind of describing a zeitgeist, if you will. I also really like the way that they use green screen in their background. So again, that's Hold My DualShock. Definitely subscribe to them.
In order to keep that high school drama level feel, it ignores the fact that this is a world where everything is taken a back seat to the fact that there is a rupture in your town that leads to another universe.
And that's the other thing. Yes, I feel like they're focusing too much on like personal drama rather than the like world ending drama.
The actual stakes that the world's about to end.
And so it kind of takes away that there is no stakes, that everyone's safe and that there's no one's going to actually be in any real danger because we're really focusing on what really matters, which is personal drama.
Fuck.
Yeah, we're not interested in telling a story. We're more interested in staying on brand.
Yeah.
And that means there has to be D&D references. That means there has to be kids in danger. If we don't have the core cast, if they're not kids anymore, we'll find more kids because...
Yeah, random kids to add to the cast.
Because there has to be kids in danger. And I think about this whole series, like, you know, the idea of like putting a Band-Aid on a very broken thing. Dude, the entire show feels like this giant Band-Aid. They have... Their reality has been fractured. They can see through to the Upside Down. There's a giant fissure in the world, and they actually put a giant metal Band-Aid. They cover it up with sheet metal and just pretend it isn't there. And that feels like that's become kind of the course for the show, right? There's clearly much more important things going on.
That's a really great way of putting it. Band-Aid. It's kind of like a microcosm for everything else that's wrong with the show. These guys are really good.
The character should be defined by the stakes that they've found themselves in, and instead all those things have to be ignored so that we can recapture the flame, the feeling, the aesthetic of early seasons of Stranger Things, even when they don't make sense anymore.
Yeah, when they no longer matter, they're more of a hindrance.
We were expected to believe that this is a world-altering event, yet the characters still have all the time in the world to go through things that I think most of us know would stop mattering if the world was about to end.
So you see why I like them so much. They made some really great points. At first, they were kind of losing me because they were saying that the personal element, shouldn't matter as much because of what was happening in the story. But really, what they were getting at is just that their personalities and the personal story should have been moved forward because their situation is so much more dire. They really shouldn't have been going back to what was first season problems, their school life, who likes who, who's getting bullied. These should be seen as more trivial things because the story should be moved forward. But the point that I really like they're making is that Stranger Things really fell into the same trap as a lot of these other giant franchises, sort of the legacy reboot trap, where instead of moving the story forward, they instead started to reference itself. Now, Stranger Things was a show based off of references, especially the first season was referencing a lot of Steven Spielberg movies, The Goonies, which he didn't direct, but it was still a Steven Spielberg produced film, E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, also a lot of Stephen King stories, especially It, because you had this group of people, group of kids in a small town. They were kind of maybe the losers or they weren't very popular, but they banded together to deal with something supernatural. Also, I think that there's some Nightmare on Elm Street, especially 1 and 3, that it was referencing. And instead of referencing other material in a very organic way, Stranger Things started to reference itself. If you think of that one image of a snake eating its tail, I think it's called Aurora Boreas, not Aurora Borealis, because I've made that mistake before. It started to become just a copy of itself. Now, other franchises that suffered the same fate, I mean, it happens a lot, but really the ones I want to talk about are Terminator and Star Wars. Terminator started out as a really good twist on the horror slasher genre, if you think about it. You have a young damsel in distress being pursued by some killer, right? But instead of just it being a human killer, it's a robot, a killer robot sent from the future because her future son is going to lead in a rebellion. And that robot is even more difficult to kill than the average human. So it kind of took the horror tropes. It takes place at night. It had a very interesting sci-fi spin to it. When it got to the sequel, James Cameron didn't just remake a horror film. In fact, he made a completely different type of film. He really made a father-son road trip film and made it more action-like, right, with a larger budget. So this moved the story forward because now you didn't just have the damsel in distress being pursued by a robot from the future. It took that same robot and made him the good guy, and instead of it being a slasher film, it really was a father son road trip action movie. The problem with a lot of the Terminators since then, especially Terminator 3, even Terminator Dark Fate, is that they're really trying to just remake Terminator 2 Judgment Day. But we never actually get to see Judgment Day. This good sequel to Terminator 2 would be what happens with the machines. Now, ironically, Terminator 3 is called The Rise of the Machines, but not really. We don't really see the transition between Terminator 2 Judgment Day and the post-apocalyptic one with Christian Bale, where, the machines have already taken over. It's already a desert wasteland. We really needed to see that transition happening, and also the transition from the kid in Terminator 2 grow up into a leadership position. We should see this ne'er-do-well kid use all of his skills and abilities that he picked up being a ne'er-do-well and see how that is uniquely prepares him for this very strange situation and how he inspires other people to follow his lead. And we missed out on all those things because there's just this lack of imagination of people who own the intellectual property, and instead they just, whether they know it or not, they're just kind of remaking Terminator 2 over and over again. And Dark Fate was basically the same thing, only they made a bunch of people women. That's not original enough. That's not as original as Terminator 2 was, if you think about it as a sequel to Terminator 1. And James Cameron used to be really great at reinventing sequels in this way. If you think about Alien, again, the first one was this kind of horror film, like Jaws in space, if you will. But the sequel just changed the game, right? There was a lot more aliens, and he made a very interesting people on a mission movie, made it like a kind of bigger budget action film. Also, a lot of people don't know this about James Cameron, but he also co-wrote the second Rambo film, Rambo First Blood Part 2. He co-wrote it with Sylvester Stallone and took that same character in the first movie, First Blood, which is really kind of a small, intimate coming home from Vietnam film that has a lot of action elements in it, and took that same character on a rescue mission to help other Vietnam vets who were prisoners of war. It was a very interesting and original idea of how to change genres, still make it feel very organic to that character. Now, the sequels after that kind of lost sight of the whole post-Vietnam vibe and trying to the redemptive arc. They got further and further away from that, but just though all three of those sequels were really interesting organic ways of moving the story forward and changing the genre, changing the influences that they could draw from. Now, with Star Wars The Force Awakens, again, we really should have seen a sequel to Return of the Jedi. We should have seen what happens when the Jedi wins. Instead of seeing any of that, we just kind of remade A New Hope. It was interesting because in Ryan Johnson's The Last Jedi, we see Luke Skywalker is very cynical about, oh, the Jedi is just, they're just a bunch of hypocrites, and he's, very demoralized about how he used to be very idealistic, and now doesn't believe anything Jedi related. And I could see his character getting there, but we never really saw that transition. We never saw what it's like when the Jedi are in power. Now, maybe since the capacity for good and evil exists in everyone's heart, yeah, of course, some Jedi could go to the dark side after they get into power, but we were robbed from seeing that because they were just so unimaginative that they just wanted to make a quick buck and remake A New Hope as opposed to making a organic sequel to Return of the Jedi. So there's a lot of other franchises that I think are suffering the same fate. I think if you look at Jurassic World, they kind of don't know how to move the story forward. I think maybe dinosaurs should be going to the mainland, which they kind of hinted at, but they didn't really ever deliver on sequels. Instead, they're just kind of remaking the past films, and they never really move the story or the characters forward. So the first lesson we'll be walking away from, based off of this Hold My DualShock video, is avoid the lure of the legacy reboot and move your story forward. Don't remake when you should be sequeling. All right. Now we're going to move forward to the second video that we got. The next video we're going to be looking at is from this YouTuber. She's a British YouTuber named Lucy, Luce. And you know what? I like her vibe. She's a little bit on the chill side, and she doesn't use as many clips, but she has a really good point. Let's get into it.
Sense. By the way, I think the thing that went wrong with Stranger Things 5 is not continuing from the season 4 cliffhanger. The season 4 cliffhanger was so good. I think them kind of having the time jump and just being like, oh yeah, we've covered the cracks, like it's fine, was very, very odd. I think they should have continued straight from the cliffhanger because that cliffhanger was very intense. And I really, really liked that cliffhanger. And
I just say that you can tell from the way that she's talking that she genuinely loves Stranger Things. She's not a hater. She's not cynical. She's not a troll. I think that there's this narrative coming from mainstream or access media and from Netflix and their representatives that anyone saying anything negative about season 5, that they are, I don't know, just in it for some money, or that there's review bombing, or that they're, I don't know, sexist or something. And you could just tell that she genuinely loves the show. That's where a lot of the criticism is coming from, is from people who fell in love with the show, fell in love with the characters, and they are the ones who know where it went wrong the most, because they're the ones paying attention. They're the ones who maybe even rewatched the show and have been waiting with bated breath for the season 4 cliffhanger to have this resolution. So let's see what else she has to say.
I think one of the main things that went wrong for them is that they didn't continue from there. I think they should continue from that if they wanted full kind of like, I don't know, it just felt like we came back and then it was like, oh yeah, the military, like we've covered the cracks. Like, why didn't we think of that before? Like, it's a bit like, okay, like I really like the concept of the Upside Down taking over the real world, and I thought that's where we were going to go. Like, I thought we would come back to Hawkins, and it would be like this kind of like you know, in like zombie apocalypse films where like everyone's been evacuated out of town, no one can come in or come out. The gang would have to break into Hawkins if they wanted to do their crawls and stuff like that. That's what I thought it would be like. The facts that like people were going to work like normal, people going to school like normal, the military kind of dealt with it so quickly. It just like felt very like we had this huge like thing, and like it just like went. So I love the concept of the upside down coming into the real world, and I think that should have stuck, I'll be honest. But I think the
Thought that only Valley girls from California used like as much as she does. I mean, I have my own I have my own word whiskers. I really shouldn't talk crap. She makes some great points there. She mentioned zombie movies. That's a great point. I mean, they could have taken or been inspired by 80s zombie films, since there's this thing with Stranger Things to take some tropes or some popular media from the 1980s and kind of do their own modern twist on it. Zombie films would certainly fall into that category. But Mad Max, there was an opportunity to see once the world and these two worlds kind of blended with each other. The Upside Down had this fissure, right, into this town of Hawkins. We could have seen a completely different town instead of just patching it up with the so-called band-aids. We could have seen a kind of post-apocalyptic world, either Mad Max or the sequel to Mad Max, Road Warrior, which is usually what people mean when they're talking about Mad Max. Not so much Fury Road, because that's a little bit more of a endless car chase movie. But yeah, we could have seen not only the world in this post-apocalyptic production design, but we also could have seen the people, how the people adjust to that awfulness, to that post-apocalyptic world. We could have seen who kind of rises to the occasion and becomes action stars. It would have been so gratifying, especially because we've been following these kind of nerdy kids who are outcasts. You could see who rises to the occasion, who kind of becomes action stars. And it would have been ironic because all of the maybe cooler kids would not have been so equipped for what was happening. They could have been looking to these nerdy kids who have been dealing with the upside down world, dealing with the Demogorgons, dealing with all these threats for seasons. They would be so much better prepared for this kind of hellscape. We just missed out on that. We missed out on all these opportunities. Instead, they just reset everything. They just reset everything to where it would be like an earlier season, and only a small group of people were affected by it. Another thing that this kind of reminds me of, another movie they could have been inspired by, is the original Red Dawn, not the remake. But the original Red Dawn had high school kids who were just going about their day. All of a sudden, there's this Russian invasion. And these kids have to kind of rise to the occasion. They have to learn how to use guns. They have to hide out into the woods. They have to use booby traps. And you see these kids who are having to grow up much faster than they ought to. One of the other criticisms that maybe we'll do an entire other video on is just that the actors aged up, but the characters weren't allowed to age up. Well, this would have been a perfect opportunity to allow those characters to age up. They have to become older in how they act. Instead of trying to do an impression of a teenager or a preteen, they could have kind of come into their own and been a little bit mature for their age. Like if you ever see a Band of Brothers or any kind of war film where, hey, those are just kids, but it's like, no, they're in these situations where they kind of have to become heroes. They have to become more mature than their years. And we missed all those opportunities. Now imagine in Red Dawn, if just halfway through the movie it resets and they're back in class and they're getting bullied and they're talking about relationships or whatever, it would have seemed so out of place. It would have seemed not an organic extension of what was going on, and the consequences of the first third of that film would have felt like they didn't matter. And so anyways, they missed this opportunity to age up the people and make the cliffhanger of the season 4 seem way more serial than they treated it. All right, so the lesson to take from this video by Lucy is that sometimes you have to change up your genre, and sometimes you have to change up your influence too. So they really should have been started to become influenced by Red Dawn, by Mad Max, The Road Warrior, by a lot of other maybe zombie films where everyone else, Dawn of the Dead or 28 Days Later, they needed to pick different things to be influenced by, not just earlier seasons of itself, like Hold My DualShock was talking about. Now, this next YouTuber we're going to be looking at is Generation Offended. I really like him a lot. I like how he edits his videos, and he's sticking to the Stranger Things. He, I think, just released another video about Stranger Things again today, so definitely worth checking out. Let's see what he's got to say.
Way. So instead of evacuating Hawkins so the government can conduct their secret interdimensional experiments in peace, they instead decide to imprison the entire town so that the people can stick around and create problems for them. Supposedly they do this because they think the townsfolk might be contaminated by the ashfall. However, this doesn't make sense because A, the military knows the Upside Down's air is breathable, and B, it's been 18 months since the season 4 finale. So surely there would be some signs by now that people have been infected by something. I mean, I know that the government wouldn't put people on lockdown without a good reason, right? Right? Then there's the issue of the portal itself. I mean, after an earthquake rocked the town and a giant dimensional portal opened up, wouldn't you think that evacuating the civilians would be the government's top priority? After all, what if it happens again? Or what if an army of strange and evil creatures comes through from the other side? Wouldn't you want everyone to be at a safe distance? I know I wouldn't want to be at ground zero of an interdimensional invasion, so there is no good reason for the townsfolk to be there. It doesn't make any sense for their own safety, and they're simply inconveniencing the military. After all, this would be a super secret project. For example, you wouldn't want a bunch of meddling teenagers wandering around causing you trouble. But hey, then the show wouldn't happen, right? Oh no. Even on a practical defense level, the army never seems to put any effort into patrolling or stopping any spies from watching the base. We see in the first episode that Mike and Lucas are able to get into this tower and observe the entire military operation without anyone spotting them.
At the end, he kind of went into a category that we might make a separate video about, just about the military and how they seem to be kind of ineffectual. They don't seem to be much of a threat to our protagonists towards the end. Very inconsistent that they're around, but they seem to be pretty lax about their security. But that maybe belongs in its own video. The other things he was bringing out is, why not evacuate? Why didn't they evacuate? They shouldn't be worried that the people got it contaminated. I don't think where are the people getting contaminated? We haven't really seen any of that happen. And again, like he pointed out, it's been 18 months. So the military would want probably to keep this a secret. They wouldn't want everyone to just be casualties if there's interdimensional beings that could easily come out of this portal. And by the way, why aren't there interdimensional beings coming out of this portal? That's kind of what it seemed like was going to happen at the end of season 4. Why is it so easy to patch everything up? We could have had a bunch of monsters coming out and and killing people, either main cast members or secondary cast members or even just strangers. And also, if you were somebody who lived in this town, you would want to leave anyways. Who wants to be next to an interdimensional portal that's, releasing all these monsters and all these different threats and everything like that? So it had very practical reasons why the military should want to evacuate this area. But outside of that, we missed out on the opportunity, like Lucy was bringing out earlier with zombie films. We missed out on the opportunity of seeing Hawkins evacuated, seeing it not have any people in it, seeing it destroyed, and seeing it like there's this wasteland. We've seen it as this idyllic small little town in Indiana for season after season. We could have seen it just abandoned. We could have seen, if you kind of think of things like 28 Days Later in London or I Am Legend, how it treats New York City, there's something sort of gratifying about seeing these places that are normally populated and normally bustling with activity completely abandoned, and maybe a character or a few characters or cadre of characters having the run of the place, and also seeing it more dilapidated than we've seen it before. The town kind of plays its own character, and it would be cool to see that town change in a very dynamic way. And the town could be abandoned for the most part, and then we could have the small group of principal characters trying to break back into the town. And that shouldn't be easy either. They should have their own trouble doing that, but they, have to either defeat monsters that have broken into our world or go to the Upside Down. But regardless, they should have to break into what is an abandoned city of Hawkins. That would have been so much cooler than what we saw. We also could have seen just a lot of more dead bodies, a lot of people becoming under attack from these monsters. And it just kind of seems like they, instead of doing all that, they just went business as usual. Everyone's kind of just sledding down these potholes or sinkholes that have been have band-aids on them, and it just too closely resembles earlier seasons, both in how the city looks, the fact that not too many people even know that anything is going on, which doesn't really fit with reality, and the fact that our characters kind of had a stunted growth. They're not having a time to shine in a very unusual post-apocalyptic type scenario. Okay, now the fourth and final video we're going to check out, it is from Dark Hour. Now, you're going to see with his clip that he has a translucent anime character kind of flipping us off. And that may sound strange, but, there's a lot of copyright strikes coming from Netflix, especially about Stranger Things, especially about season 5, and especially about going against YouTube channels that took a critical view at season 5. So it may seem a little bit strange, but there's a perfectly good reason why he's doing that. So we covered up what we could, and let's see what he's got to say.
And now they're essentially in an open-air military prison. How are there enough supplies or even people for this town to function?
I don't know.
How do they restock their stores, and does no one work outside of the borders?
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and hit you with an... I don't know.
I don't know about you, but I would have bounced around the time a meat spider killed a bunch of people in the middle of a 4th of July sale. Speaking of the earthquake, what...
He made some really great points. I really like the clip from that 70s show that he used. It makes you realize how good of an actor Topher Grace is. So it might sound like he's being a little nitpicky, but let's just go over some of what he was saying. How is everyone, if they're under lockdown, if they haven't evacuated Hawkins, right? How come their friends and family don't care, right? They're not trying to check in on them. And how is food coming into this town, anyways? There was a little bit of this subplot around bacon, around Mike's father, Ted Wheeler's bacon. Now, all the kids stealing his bacon, that could have been a much bigger deal because how is he even getting the bacon? How much bacon is there in this town? Now, again, like I said, this could seem like it's just minutia, but this minutia, if you handle it correctly, can make the ramifications of what's going on feel so much realer, feel like a much bigger deal. And the two examples that I thought of, whereas one, there's a show called Foyle's War. I don't know if you've ever seen it before, but it's a really well written show. It was basically a kind of Columbo type show. It was a mystery detective show, but it took place during World War II in a small town in England. You got to see how this small town had to deal with all of the problems of World War II from the lead up, during, and after. Things like food shortages, things like food rationing, and the black markets that pop up when that happens. And it wasn't just a throwaway detail. You had scenes where, Foyle, you think that maybe he's in on the black market, but really he's trying to arrest people. There were certain characters that built the whole business around this black market. And you had entire episodes and murder mysteries around the fact that, people were selling black market goods, making money, killing each other over the profits. And that detail isn't just something that's, thrown away as being minutia. They really, that's going to affect the characters that live in this time period and in the location. And they didn't miss that opportunity. Now, another example that comes to mind is the miniseries V, the original miniseries V, which is incredibly well written. I definitely recommend you check it out. It might seem a little bit dated, but if you just go by the writing, it's really incredible. They remade it, but they kind of messed with a lot of what made the writing so great in it. And one thing going on with V, it's about its alien invasion, where these aliens at first seem very benevolent, but then you start to see how much control they have. And, you have a small cadre of humans trying to fight them. And it seems like all the chips are stacked against them. But there are these two brothers, right? One has always lived with integrity, and the other brother is kind of a ne'er-do-well. But the ne'er-do-well brother, he's selling black market eggs just to profit himself. He doesn't really care about the bigger fight or what's right or integrity or anything like that. But then, I'm not going to spoil it, but something happens where the ne'er-do-well brother completely changes his tune and uses everything that he knew, all of his connections, where he was doing stuff just to benefit himself, selling like black market eggs and I don't know, he has other stuff going on. But you can see how that expertise, how his skill set, once it's repurposed to benefit everybody else, once it's repurposed to fight this alien invasion, you could see what an incredible asset he is. And it's the same person who has a shift of what he cares about, and yet you see in this trying times who he really is. That usually, he was just looking out for himself, maybe breaking a lot of laws back before anything mattered. And now you see what a great asset he is in this fight against this evil alien invasion. So when people like this, they kind of nitpick some of the world building or the lax world building, it might seem like, they're just being trolls or they're picking at things that don't really matter. But what you're missing out on is it doesn't feel like there's really any consequences to anything that's going on. And it doesn't feel very real. The world building seems very narrow. And you see that there are like these missed opportunities for scenes that are compelling and unique to the story that they're telling, and missed opportunities for character development, for characters kind of rising to the occasion in very unusual circumstances. So, what do we learn? Well, we learn to move your story forward. Don't fall into the legacy sequel trap by remaking when you should be sequeling. Switch up your genres and influences as your story demands. But you gotta know your genre. Learn whatever genre you're dipping into. The Duffer Brothers knew and understood moody horror and youth-based nostalgia in their first season. That's why it was so good. But they never learned how to write fantasy, they never learned how to write love stories, and they never learned how to write post-apocalyptic disaster stories. This hindered their ability to deliver on the compelling cliffhanger they set up in season 4. Don't skip the interesting part. Know where your story is, especially when you set up an engaging cliffhanger and your audience is waiting 3 years for its resolution. And finally, keep on writing, because no matter what they say, anyone can cook, and you are not a bot.